Hello, everybody. Welcome to the channel. Today, we're going to be talking about a Game of Thrones, but in this discussion, we're mostly going to focus on the characters. So we have wonderful guests here. I'll let them introduce themselves before we go into our favorite characters and why. So starting off to my, I guess this would be to my right, Theo.
Yeah, hi, my name is Theo. My channel is Rekindled Reader, and I talk about fantasy, a little bit of sci-fi, some horror, some thrillers, mostly fantasy. That's kind of my jam. And this is the first time I've ever read Game of Thrones ever, so I'm excited to talk about it. Kind of nervous. I hope I know enough and remember enough. But yeah, I'm excited. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Jack. I have the channel Jack in the Book Stack. I always say that I read a wide variety of genres, and when it comes to fantasy, I am brand new to the genre. Read my first fantasy book last year because of BookTube. So a lot of you guys have inspired me to give the genre a try, and I figured, you know, I have to read Game of Thrones. I have to try it out and see what the hype is about. This was my first time reading it. I also have not watched the show. I think I tried a couple episodes of it. So I know character faces, but very new to the series, to the genre. So excited to talk about it. I'm sure I'm going to learn a lot too from you guys.
I have to say really quickly that I've been really enjoying Jack's channel. Although she's new to fantasy, I think she brings a very fresh perspective to the genre for that reason. And I've been really enjoying, she has some wonderful content on her channel about the Mistborn trilogy, which she read last year, and the Farseer trilogy. She has a fantastic vlog of the Farseer trilogy, which she read last month. And she also has a vlog of a Game of Thrones as well.
Her vlogs are awesome. They're so entertaining. I love it.
They're so good.
Yeah.
They're so good.
Thanks, guys.
All right, and Ben.
I'm Ben. I read. I don't know how to describe it. I mostly read fantasy. I read Game of Thrones, like A Song of Ice and Fire, a decade ago when I was like a teenager, because my parents wouldn't let me watch the show because it was too crude. But then they were quite happy giving me all the books, so I devoured them all. So I came back to it after watching the show a lot, and like I've read the books once, but I'm coming back after a decade, so it's been nice.
Fantastic.
So I'm Grace. My channel is just my full name, Grace Dion. I also I am mostly fantasy, but I do try and read a wide variety of genres too. It's kind of like mainly fantasy with a sprinkling of whatever it is that I feel like. And this is, ironically, Game of Thrones, specifically the first book, is the fantasy book that I've read the most times. It was basically my introduction to adult fantasy. Similar to Ben, I read it like a decade ago or even more at this point when I was a teenager. But for me, my parents had no idea what Game of Thrones was, so they wouldn't have had anything to say about it. I tried to get my dad to read it, and he took one look at the length of them and said no. But yeah, this is my third time reading it, but I've only reread the first book. So I'm going into Clash of Kings, I'm going to be continuing on as just a second read, but a Game of Thrones, I still love it on the third time through. So very excited.
Fantastic.
I'm Philip Chase, and I run a BookTube channel that is, well, I guess my nickname is Dr. Fantasy, so all I can talk about is fantasy on there, unless somebody like Joanna makes me read a book like Dune or something like that. So, which is kind of sci fantasy anyway, right, Joanna?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, so that's what I do on YouTube, and I read this series. Actually, the first book, I've taught it a few times in my fantasy novels course. So I think I've read it about 5 times, and the other books in the series I've read twice. And that was probably, last time I read it was about 4 years ago, I think.
Wow, but 5 times, that certainly beats me, who has only read it twice, like Grace. I'm like where Grace is. So I read the series, I think back in 2011, and then I've just been so eager for the last book, as everybody has. And I did succeed in getting my dad to read this series, which was amazing because my dad had never read a fantasy book in his life. He read a lot of suspense thriller type of books and John Grisham novels, things like that. But
That's what my dad reads.
Really?
So I'll just tell him like that means he should read this.
How funny. Well, I thought I pitched it to him as, there is a bit of a murder mystery in the first book. And he gave it a shot, and I was so surprised, and he loved it. Like right after the first book, he just binged all 5 books, kept asking me, when is he coming out with the next book? And yeah, and his favorite character was Tyrion. So I'll just go ahead and say that now.
Surprise,
But,
surprise. Yeah.
So we'll go ahead and start with the first prompt, which is that how does George R.R. Martin succeed in creating such memorable characters? Or another way to put this is what stuck out to you, as especially Theo, we're starting with you as a first-time reader.
Okay.
What stuck out to you about the way that Martin approaches characters?
Well, for me, so yeah, again, this is the first time I've ever read anything by George R.R. Martin, and I mean, his writing was incredibly easy to get into. Like I was sort of intimidated by it. I thought that I was going to be bombarded with a lot of characters and really, I wouldn't say flowery prose, but maybe really technical writing and maybe a lot of complex like fantasy lingo and stuff. And it was so easy to get into. And he obviously bounces between POVs quite a lot, and so you're in these characters' heads. You're really intimate with all these people, and he just does it very fluid. Like he switches between characters very fluidly, and the dialogue was a lot easier to digest than I thought it would be. Like I thought I wouldn't really know what's going on, but it was really easy to get into. The dialogue's quick. It's all really clever. It's all really well written. All the characters have kind of their own issues. They all felt like real people, and so the dialogue was really easy to read, and it all felt really authentic. And I think it's just the way that every character kind of has their moment, and it all just felt you just felt really invested really quick. Like it's been a while since I read a book cover to cover that I was just so enthralled with, and a lot of it came down to the character work primarily. So I'm happy to be on this stream for sure.
Fantastic. And you have some agreement here in the chat with Tall Guy Reads. Says the writing is very accessible.
Yeah. I was not surprised by that, but comforted by that. I'm like, okay, sweet. I can get in and I can enjoy it because I'm newer to fantasy. I read fantasy growing up, and then I took a really long time off. So now I'm like full in to adult fantasy, and I'm trying to get some of the best, and that sometimes can imply more difficult, right? Because it's like the best, fantasy, and I didn't find it to be that way necessarily. So I was happy. Yeah.
Wonderful. Jack, what about you as a first-time reader?
I would agree with Theo with the multiple POVs. I think if I knew going into this book that we were going to have perspectives from 8+ different characters, I would have been very, very intimidated. That's not something that I typically like in books because I find it very chaotic and hard to connect. But each character has such an independent personality, independent voice, that it was very clear in my head who each one was, what their motivations were. And, I don't know if I was influenced by the fact that there is a TV show and I can picture the actors' faces in my head. That could attribute to it a little bit to it. But I really like how that was written. And the writing style was so immersive for me that I would read it before bed, and then I would dream at night that I was one of the characters, it's terrifying. You don't want to live in this book, right? But the characters were so vibrant to me that I became one of them. And something that was really interesting to me that I noticed throughout my read is how a lot of the characters were outcasts in their own ways. Mm-hmm. So even though they had independent voices, they did have this similarity of being an outcast for being the bastard son, for being a female that wants to fight, for being a dwarf, right? There's all these different characters that align with this, and maybe not even at the beginning of the book, but throughout the course of it, become outcasts in their journey. So independent characters, and yet a lot of common themes.
Wonderful. And I know you brought up some of that in your fantastic vlog of this book as well, the way he contrasts characters. So very well said. All right, Ben, and Ben did a wonderful review as well, and I'd love to hear your thoughts as a rereader.
Yeah, so I feel sorry for the last two in terms of coming to this because I feel like everyone's slowly chopping away at the answers I'd give. But I would say, coming to it a second time, I feel like I really appreciated that every single character feels like they are vulnerable, and and also have strength as a result of that. And so you naturally want to read about the plight they're going through, or like when they're striving and when they're like suffering. Um, and then also like every character has like a key quote. Like there are such poignant and like really key quotes to every single character that the moment you read them early on, you're like, I know exactly who this is. And that just feeds you from then onwards. Like you have a concrete image in your head based on like just a one line reference that grounds you in who they are. So those two things always go to me.
Fantastic. And Grace, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I mean, Ben referenced it already, but I feel like I'm kind of picking things that Theo and Jack already said. But at the same time, I feel like what I would boil it down to in like a technical sense of how George R.R. Martin kind of built the memorable characters was that each of them has a thing, but they don't just become like a trope or an archetype of a character because he like does so well at expounding and like expanding upon that thing. So like Sansa might be like the ladylike girly girl, or Arya might be like the tomboy, or like it's just something like that where there could be like one thing that you can distill down upon to describe them, but then like you guys have said, they have their vulnerabilities and their strengths and everything that just makes them, I don't know, feel like real people. So none of them are perfect. They've like, I don't know. I don't know how I can say it any better than like the three people previous to me have said it, but that's definitely the reason why I think each of them are so distinct and memorable.
Fantastic. And Philip, would this pass the dialogue test?
I think so. Yeah, I think that Martin would score high on the dialogue test, meaning if you were to turn to a page and not know who was speaking and read the dialogue, you would know which character was speaking. I think he would score pretty high on that one. Yeah. For me, I think a lot of the secret to Martin's success with his characters is conflict. And it's interesting how Martin is often wrongly attributed with a quote by William Faulkner that says something like, "There's nothing worth writing about but the human heart in conflict with itself." That is something that Martin has quoted. And that was something that Faulkner wrote and said in a lecture. And it's obvious that he took that to heart with his characters. And you think about all these characters who we love in the series, there's a conflict at the heart of them. Eddard is trying to decide between, loyalty to his family or loyalty to the realm, right? Because he's called to go be the hand, and then he wants to stay home. Jon Snow has the loyalty between the wall, and then of course later on his family. And there's this conflict, and there's a lot of tension built into these conflicts. Every single character, every major character has this really wonderful conflict built within their character arc. And speaking of character arcs, I think that each of these major characters has a lot of them anyway, have a kind of hero's journey. I mean, they break the archetypes in many ways, but you do see a lot of these, especially the younger ones, like Arya and Jon. They're going through a process of maturing, and in that process, it's very much of a coming of age type thing, I suppose, in a very rough way for some of them. So I think that's also a way that we become invested in those characters. Only one thing that I think Martin does really brilliantly is he blends the archaic with something that is accessible. Theo was talking about how accessible writing is, and I completely. But if you actually look at Martin's prose, he uses a lot of archaic words. He uses words that really signal to the reader, this is not our world. This is a different world. This is an older feel to it. Mm-hmm. And everyone knows, I think he's been inspired by 14th and 15th century, the War of the Roses, etc. So I think he does a brilliant job. Even if you look at the names of the characters, a lot of them are familiar names, but with a bit of a tweak, right? Like John with one N and no H, or Eddard instead of Edward, right? I mean, he has these little tweaks that these are names that we kind of feel are familiar, but they're actually different. They're exotic. We're in this fantasy world. So that's something he achieves brilliantly in the prose, in the naming of the characters. I think he's just a master, really, in those respects. And I think all of that feeds into the sense of identification we have with those characters.
Yeah, that's beautifully said. And I love the way you framed that with the conflict and especially kind of piggybacking off of what Grace was saying too about how, even with the children characters or the child characters, they're not one note. He's still not afraid to give them a sense of conflict as well. So that's really interesting too, what you said, Philip, about the how he gives you some indication that this is kind of like our world, but a slightly archaic version of it. And the accessibility of the prose, as Theo said, I think that that's absolutely true as well. Somebody earlier in the chat mentioned that Martin had written script before, or he had written film script before, and how that influenced his writing to some degree, possibly. So it's just interesting the way he was able to do that, though, create so many different characters. And I think the dialogue is absolutely incredible. Like, somebody was also mentioning the inner dialogue of characters. I think that Derry was mentioning that as well in the chat here. Yeah, inner dialogue. I think that is so well done as well. And the way that the characters, you'll hear a character like Viserys say, "Wake the dragon," and then Daenerys has that thought over and over again circulating in her mind. And of course, it comes to mean something else eventually. But I really appreciate the way he gets characters to do that, because I think especially when you're young, you internalize what other people are saying and letting it influence you. And you do see that happen quite a bit. See how characters influence one another. All right, so from here, let's go ahead and talk about favorite characters. So again, kind of going clockwise with Theo. Theo, who is your favorite character and why?
This is probably the hardest question, because I came away from this book being like, holy crap, like these guys are all so good, so fun, so interesting to read about. All the arcs that Philip alluded to, like everybody has their moments and their development, and everyone has their kind of authentic, thing. And I was going to mention too, it was similar to Abercrombie, where like you can really tell who's speaking even without, you know what I mean? Like it's just the dialogue was so good. Anyway, my favorite as a first time reader, obviously at the beginning, was Tyrion, because he's just awesome, and I just loved reading his chapters. But one thing that I noticed too was I really liked Jon, and I watched most of the show. I would say I probably watched up to maybe season 6, and it was a long time ago, and I think I breezed through the last little bit that I watched, so I don't really remember too much. But I remember not like Jon was cool, and I recognize his place in the series from what I can remember of it. But I really liked Jon in the book, and I kind of like how he filled that role a little bit that was left. I guess we'll talk about that later from Ned, where you need this kind of honorable, straight as an arrow kind of family first character, and I really liked him. I also really like Sam and his development. I'm excited to see where he goes and how he grows and his relationship with Jon. The one that stuck out for me, and I'm just listing all these characters. What are all the characters in Game of Thrones? Let me tell you. I left really liking the Hound, Sandor Clegane. I really, really liked his whenever he's on page. He wasn't a point of view, I don't think, but he was just really, really deep and complex, and we got a little bit of his backstory. And I'm about a third of the way through Clash of Kings, and so that transition is a little blurry, but we do get a little bit backstory of the Hound, and I just want to get to know what this is all about. And I just remember thinking about him quite often. So my answer is all the characters A+.
All the characters
What
A+.
can I say?
Yay.
A+.
All the characters except
I basically took everyone's answer going forward.
That's high praise.
Yeah.
All right, Jack.
Well, there are some characters left for me that that Theo didn't mention. So obviously, Tyrion is, I think, a crowd favorite probably
so
for
good.
everyone, because he's so witty and intelligent and no BS, straight to the point. So I
Yeah.
think someone asked in a comment, first time readers, what was your favorite POV to read from? Tyrion would be my answer for that question specifically. But my favorite overall character has got to be Daenerys, because I loved her journey, how she went from really being a victim to being very empowered. And, you know, I like the moments that she stuck up for other women. But something I really appreciate in characters is the intelligence. And she had such social awareness.
Yeah.
Kind of play the game and, you know, pick up on the culture that was around her and not have this inflated sense of self-importance like her brother, right? So she really was socially aware and played that to her advantage. So I think her overall journey makes her my favorite character, and followed closely by the direwolves as my favorite characters, because I actually really appreciated how each one mirrored the personality of their owner.
Yeah, that was cool. That was
Yeah.
cool. Yeah.
So Theo, you didn't mention them, so
That's true. The wolves were pretty cool. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, he did very well with animal companions for sure. I mean, those
Yeah.
direwolves were fantastic.
That can be really cheesy. Like it can be such a trope. Like it can just be. It's very easy to screw up, I think. But it was done so well, and complemented the story, like Jack kind of alluded to. Yeah.
Yeah, beautiful. Ben.
I'm gonna do the same as everyone else, which is originally say that I love Tyrion. And on first read, Tyrion would have definitely been it. But I'm also gonna do like everyone else and just kind of scooch by him and give a shout out to someone else. And that's Varys. I absolutely love Varys in this read. It's the same as the Hound. That I think they're similar characters that I was reading them and I was like, I need to know every detail about them as a human being. I need to know their backstory, what's happened to them for them to be here. And I think with Varys, the reason being is that he has such interesting dynamics with every other character, like him and Ned, and the way I would say as like a trifecta that I love Varys' relationship with Ned, and then I love Littlefinger's relationship with Ned as a parallel. Yeah. And the fact that Ned finds himself following Littlefinger because Littlefinger is trying to give him a bit more in the sense of something tangible, whereas Varys is just quite honest with him in some points. And I love the idea that Ned is just like, because that's what you'd expect. If you're going to try to talk to Ned, you need to be honest. But Ned is like, you're all liars, so I don't believe you. And I find Varys and Ned's relationship so interesting as a result for that. Yeah, mine's definitely Varys now.
That is a fascinating answer. I loved what you said. I had not thought about it that way before, about why Ned trusts Littlefinger more than I think that's amazing. Sorry. Cool insight. All right, Grace.
Okay, so I mean, I'm gonna kind of scoot past Tyrion as well. Like, he's not necessarily a cut above other characters for me. He is simply like one of my favorites, but I think that he gets his due, like in terms of people recognizing him as a character. Yeah. And I'm gonna kind of contrast within my own experience two characters that I want to like shout out, which is Arya and Sansa. So for me, reading this as like, I think probably 15 or 16-year-old girl, I was like, I have always loved Arya. On my first read, she was my favorite character for sure. I think that like, I always loved her being, I guess, going her own way, like just saying, well, I don't really care what's expected of like highborn ladies. She's like, this is just kind of how I want to spend my time. Like, why do you guys want to force me to do needlework when I just want to, like, I don't know, play with a sword? And then her journey was also great. Like, I've always loved her lessons with Syrio and the fact that they lead her to that wild goose chase through the chambers of the Red Keep. And she finds out some very important information that, as we were mentioning earlier, like comes from the mind of a child. So she doesn't recognize the like importance of what she's hearing. And I think that like On my first and second read, I just loved like the adventure of Arya. I always had so much fun reading from her perspective. And when I was really young, I just found Sansa so annoying. But I've like grown to love her more with each time I've read the book. And I think that she's honestly one of the most interesting characters in terms of uh, internal, like, I guess it is internal conflict, because she is like a sweet summer flower that wants the world to be a certain way. And she is given like the rudest awakening possible, that it's like never going to be like it is in the songs. And like, and that's like, I know you guys have mentioned the Hound, but her relationship and conversations with him like highlight that so well. And I think that I have an appreciation as an older like person now, looking back, that Sansa is really young. She's just doing her best. Like, she's not trying to be annoying. She just wants things to be nice, but they're not. And near the end of the book, she's in a very bad scenario. Like, she wants so badly to be like around people that are going to protect her, but she's just not. And I found that interesting to me personally on this particular read, because I still do love Arya, like I always have, but Sansa really stuck out to me on this one. So yeah.
Oh, I love hearing your thoughts about that. Thank you. And Philip.
Well, let's see who's left here. I actually am not going to skip over Tyrion, because everybody skipped over Tyrion. So let's talk about Tyrion.
Yes.
But first, my backup choice was going to be Syrio Forel, because he is my favorite secondary character. And just for the tiny amount of page time that he has, I think he has a huge impact.
Yeah, yeah.
A lot of that is because of, talk about distinct voices. I think he has the most distinct voice in the entire book. And I think Martin must have had a good time writing his part. So I really enjoyed just the vividness of his character. I also really think, well, we're going to talk about favorite moments later, but one of my favorite moments is definitely a Syrio Forel moment. And you probably all know what I'm talking about, but we'll save it for later. But the notion of sacrifice, I guess, tied to that moment, it was something that won me over as well. But let's talk about Tyrion a little bit, and maybe Joanna has something to say about Tyrion as well. But I think he does capture a lot of our admiration, because he is put on a sort of hero's journey. He's got the classic beginnings in some ways. He has the issues with his father. He's missing his mother, which is a very common formula in fantasy, to be an orphan or a half orphan, if you will, and to be ostracized, alienated from the remaining parent. So it really is a matter of finding oneself. But he does so differently. He does so, his main weapon is his mind. And we admire him for that. He's brilliant. I always feel like his perspective chapters are the ones I'm most eager to get to and to read through without even, it's not even close. I mean, I just love his chapters. And I think he's witty and he's fun. He's an underdog. He's easy to identify with, but also, he has some of the classic virtues that, because of his size, people might not necessarily attribute to him. But he's courageous at times. Obviously, he has fear. When he has to go into battle, and he does it with that crazy helmet on and everything else, the battle axe, and gets ultimately cheered on as the half man and all of that. I mean, he was terrified, but he also just goes in and does it. He rolls up his sleeves and goes in and does it. So just a lot to love about that character, I think. So that's all I'll say, and I'll let Joanna have the last word on Tyrion.
Oh, I'm so glad that we're not skipping over Tyrion completely. Because, I mean, well, if there's any indication about my favorite characters, I mean, you all saw the thumbnail to this live show. I might have highlighted a couple of them. But with Tyrion, I think what's also really interesting about Tyrion for me is if you think about dwarves in fantasy, especially if you think of Tolkien, and you think about how dwarves are a separate race, and at least in Tolkien's world, they live under a mountain. They just have a different way of being, and they kind of have a gruffness to them, a grisliness to them. And Tyrion is, I think in some ways, he's very humorous, and what I love about him, though, is that Martin doesn't paint him that way. He's not a separate race. He comes from a noble household. And I think I think it's just brilliant to me how, even though he comes from this background, and he can be a bit vulgar at times, he's so honest. Like the way the conversations, like, for example, that he had on the wall. Well, I know that's moments. I'm probably getting into moments now, but I'll just say that he just has a way of getting characters to look at things very truthfully. And at the same time, he does it in a very smart way. And he has certain insights about his own family members. He doesn't delude himself at all about anything. And
Right.
it seems like as a result of him being considered the killer of his own mother through his own birth and the way that his family looks at him, it's like he has no shame in being able to look at things that other people are scared to look at or ashamed to look at. So I really appreciated that about Tyrion. And I just think it's brilliant to me. The whole story, oh man, I'm going in a moment, so I should probably save that. So anyway, I guess all that to say is, before I get ahead of myself, I just appreciated so many aspects of Tyrion's character and how I feel like Martin was very aware when he did that, when he took what was familiar in fantasy with fantasy dwarves and did something totally different with that character. And I don't know if this is totally true, but I thought I had heard in one of the interviews for the show that was the one perspective where Martin saw himself as a character in the show, in the series, was through Tyrion's perspective. And the other character I'm going to go ahead and highlight again is Arya. I loved Arya's character, especially with especially with what we were talking about with Syrio Forel. But I love Arya because for me, she was very relatable, especially the scenes where she's knitting and she can't quite compete with her sister doing everything so perfectly and as a lady should, and what a lady should do. And Sansa living up to this ideal perfection of what a woman should be in this world. And Arya realizing early on, I don't fit this and I'm not going to. And I'm going to, it's kind of like what Jack was saying earlier about the outcast type of thing. Or marching to the beat of your own drum. For me, it was very relatable because I think I was that child in a way. I think I was I like to see myself a little more as like Arya Stark, but she makes it more heroic in a way too. So I thought that was really cool, the way she did, the way that Martin played with that. The third character I'm quickly going to mention, and I know I'll talk more about this, I'm sure, when we talk about character moments as well, but is Ned Stark. And I feel like this is a little bit of an unpopular opinion. I could be wrong about this, but I know chatting with some people, I feel like a lot of people have a lot of judgment of Ned. But when I read this, especially rereading it this time, I felt his conflict. I felt his conflict so much, and I was rooting for him. And there's so much more I could probably say about him, but I think that his conflict, like what Philip was saying earlier about his split between his loyalty towards his family and loyalty to the realm, but also this idea of doing what's right and dutiful and balancing that with mercy, having that conflict within him felt to me, I felt every moment of it.
Joanna, for what it's worth, he was the fourth character that I had on my favorites with Tyrion and the girls. So I completely agree with you. And the first time reading this book, I suppose it's not actually the ending. There's a lot of falling action afterwards, but that moment absolutely gutted me the first time I read this book.
I knew it was coming and I was still like, God damn, like Ned.
Yeah.
I had a feeling because it's so symbolic, like the ending of his, like, I don't know, ideology almost, like this type of man can't thrive in this world. But yeah, so I agree with you.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to Ned, and even just the parental parts, the parts where he's talking to Sansa, and the parts where he's talking to Arya, and they're fighting between each other like sisters will. But the way that he tries to explain how important it is that they unite as a family, and even the way that Robb takes certain things, and Bran too, the way you could see his influence on them. So again, talking about how characters influence one another in this series, you could see how Robb got certain notions of leadership from his father, and about the idea that you get your men to trust you, to follow you by letting them know you. And that's so different than the way Catelyn teaches him about leadership, which we can get into. But there was so much. I had so much respect for Ned. I had so much respect for him. And I feel like it's very easy to say, oh, well, he wasn't being strategic, and it's like, well, he had a code, he had a certain, yes. And maybe it was a little bit naive in some ways to think that everybody else would follow the same moral code that he would. But I don't know. To me, it worked for him. It clearly worked for him in the North to a certain extent of time. Going south, obviously things changed, but I loved Ned. He won me over so hard in this book, even knowing what was going to happen. All right, so I've talked a lot. I apologize, but I want to hear what you all think about. Tall Guy Reads asked about this earlier. This was actually a prompt I had, and that is favorite unlikable characters. So these are characters that you love to hate, because Martin has a way of writing very detestable, unlikable characters. And so, Theo, we'll start with you.
Yeah, this one is interesting because what makes him so talented, I think, is like, yeah, you're rooting for people you don't like. You're reading, like, he's so good at making everybody relatable, and everybody has their good and their bad, and it's all very authentic. Like I'm gonna circle back to something Ben said. So I think I'm gonna have Varese as like a character that I don't really like. He's a slimy little like ghosty person. But I loved reading about him, and I loved his interactions and his relationships and like the conflict surrounding him, and of course Littlefinger too. But he was one where every time he got on page, I was like, oh, this guy, like, but I couldn't stop enjoying myself while reading him. So just as a visceral kind of like feeling, just a gut, like, I hate this guy, it was Varese for me.
Yeah. Good choice.
Sorry, Ben.
Is it Viserys? Am I saying it wrong then? Are you
No,
you're talking
Lord
about
Varese.
Danny's?
Lord Varese.
Oh, Lord Varys. Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. Not Viserys. Yeah.
Okay. Got it.
Yeah. The eunuch.
All right.
Yeah, I kind of disliked everyone under the age of 13. So I don't know what that says about me. So I was reading this and I did not like Sansa at all. I don't think we're supposed to. Or we're supposed to be frustrated with her, I think. Not dislike her, but frustrated. But I was thinking, if I had kids, more specifically, if I had teenagers, I would want them to read this to see how ridiculous they look when they think they know everything. Right? When she's saying,
Yeah.
but I love Joffrey, but I love him. I'm like, you are like, there's not a reader out there that thinks this girl is sane at that moment. Like, are your eyes not open? He killed your dog. Like, I don't, that's a red flag.
Like Grace said, she's desperately clinging to she's so close to having everything perfect, and it just gets ripped away, right? And so that rude awakening, I can see that being so annoying.
So
but it's more about being in love with your idea versus reality.
Exactly.
That's what it is for her.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She's like
she wants
almost
the status.
deliberately blind to it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. And I thought it was interesting, kind of the theme going out that I think the theme going on, I think coming from Ned, he's lecturing, I think, Arya about lying and how lying is bad. You always want to be truthful. Sometimes you have to do it, right, for the greater good. And, that moment with Sansa, with the direwolf situation, and with the lady, right, was the name of hers, and Joffrey, she lied for a very selfish reason. She said she didn't see what happened with Arya and Joffrey. She lied for a very selfish reason because she wants to protect her image. And as a result, she lost her dog, right? And so to me, she's just selfish, and she cares more about status, which is very frustrating. But that I think I know everything kind of attitude is what drove me crazy about her. And then, sorry, Donna, but I really didn't like Ned. I wanted to. My Disney heart wants to root for the good guy that has high morals and likes peace and kindness, but he made his kindness a weakness. And I was rooting for him. We were all rooting for him, and he let me down. And the key moment, I know we're going to talk about moments, but I think those are moments that we like. Maybe I was screaming at the book when he was talking to Cersei and said, I know everything. I'm going to get you. And I'm like, you are just so naive to think this is going to work. I think I annotated my edition, and I think on that page I was just writing my reaction, taking it out on my paperback because I was so mad.
Yeah.
So those were the unlikable characters for me.
You're not alone on that. I think for me, just in my defense, and this is a really naive defense because I think, well, I don't know how to frame this. Except to say that when I read those parts, when I read about Ned making the naive choice or whatever, I just think about our politics and how people are always like, why are politicians so corrupt? And it's like, well, we never make space for people not to be corrupt. And Ned is the example of somebody who's just going to be who he is no matter what and not let that bring him down. And so I guess to me, he's sort of a hero in that way. But obviously, it doesn't work in this world. And maybe it doesn't even work in our real world, sadly. But but I hear you. I hear you.
I agree with you. I wanted strength in kindness. And yet it was his kindness that, you know, in believing the best in people that led to his downfall.
Yeah.
I didn't know there was an anti-Ned movement happening. That this is a pre-existing thing. I always kind of loved Ned. My unlikable character is was a shock to me reading it for the first time. As in, I said that sentence completely incorrectly. It was a shock to me coming around the second time. Because I didn't have any ill feelings towards them, and that's Catelyn. Reading Catelyn this time, this first book, I was like, I know you're in a bad situation, but even before that, you're doing some bad things. Like her relationship with Jon, because it comes down to the what Martin does so well is giving people really unlikable traits and then giving a very justifiable reason for it. So her treatment of Jon is absolutely horrible and detestable, and it physically irks me every time she has an interaction with him or he even thinks about her, because she's so spiteful towards him. The fact that like he's like 15 or like 14 and it's the first time she said his name, I think they say, is truly horrific. But then you also know that from her perspective, it doesn't justify it, but it justifies it from her perspective, is that she had just met Jon and then just met Ned, and then Ned had gone off to war and come back. And so she's in the same situation as Sansa in her head, in a kind of way where she had this idealistic thing. It's been removed from her. Her new husband that wasn't meant to be a husband has gone off and come back with a child. Like her image of what was going to happen has been torn to shreds. But it doesn't make her not the most unlikable person for me. And then I like her. The thing is, while she's unlikable, I still enjoy her journey when she goes to the Vale and kind of realizes, I think she sees herself in Liza at some points. Like when she goes there, she sees a further version of herself, and then she realizes that the path she's walking down, in the sense of trying to get revenge and justice, and then as a result is like, we need to get out of here. Like we've messed up. She's gone too far. We need to backtrack. And I think I like her journey, but she has some very unlikable moments for me.
Yeah.
So Ben stopped just short of stealing my answer, which, well, one of them is Lysa Arryn. I think that one of the things that, like, looking at it in an overall perspective, I think that one of the things that, like, Martin does well is making characters that are just not good people on, like, sort of like the good side. Like, Lysa tries to stay out of everything, and that's part of why I don't like her. But as like Catelyn's sister, and the way that we see the Starks act and like other families act, she like should be like, as the holder of the Vale and the Eyrie, willing to help, and like, and instead her and her son is understandably like not being brought up very well. She's still like breastfeeding him at the age of 6 or 7 or whatever he is, and she's like, I understand that she's scared, but she is like the worst role model ever. and she's bringing up, and it sounds stupid to say, but a very childish child. And like when you compare them to other, like say Bran around the same age, it's like night and day based on like who their parents were, which is I honestly don't even have like, I feel like I don't have that much to say about Liza. She's just very distasteful to me. And then another one that I came up with, and I don't honestly know whether this is popular or unpopular because hate isn't the right word, but on this read, I was just struck by how unlikable Robert Baratheon is. Like, I feel like I am so close, like it's almost like it's on the tip of your tongue, like seeing how he used to be, like the way that Ned sees him. But the fact of the matter is, at the present time in the book, that's not who he is. Like he has descended into just like a drunken, useless king who does absolutely nothing. And you can see it even more in the fact that clearly Cersei has influenced how their children were brought up, which is how you get people like Joffrey. I mean, Myrcella and Tommen are surprisingly nice children, but maybe it's because they weren't being raised to be the heir. I don't know. But I was just struck by how like Robert would have been, like some characters say, like made for battle and like made for winning the throne, but not a good leader at all. And so I was maybe even disappointed in him, I guess. It just really stuck out to me on this read. So, yeah.
Yeah. And the way he's willing to sacrifice babies, you
Yeah.
know, children. Yeah.
Not a good
Yeah. And Ned is trying to be a moral compass like that. That stuck out to me quite a bit too.
Yeah. Wow. You guys all had such great answers. And I was going to start with Sansa, but I think Jack did a fantastic job already of talking about her. What about someone who's responsible for other unlikable characters? What about Tywin Lannister? I think you could say Joffrey easily is not the most likable person, but you could also say that neither of his parents is very likable, and that some of that probably comes from the patriarch of the Lannister family, right? So and it's funny because I read the books before the show, but I have a hard time now separating Charles Dance, the actor who plays such a brilliant job, I think, in the show, from the book character. Even I think he just is that good in the role, and he conveys that sense of someone who is just driven and very capable, very intelligent, but very self-centered. And it's a question of where his I guess loyalties are. They're his almost narcissistic insistence on the Lannisters, which he pretty much equates with himself, because what's good for the Lannisters is good for Tywin, I suppose. But I think a lot of his how he traumatizes his kids, including Tyrion, but also to a large degree Cersei and Jaime, has repercussions that are very big for the entire series. So I would guess he's a good answer for somebody who messes up a lot of people. Yeah.
Yeah. Goodness, man, so much to choose from. Now I'm like stumped a little bit about the characters that I disliked the most. I know that Tall Guy Reads was asking us about Jaime, and I don't think I think he kind of answered this here. We don't get as much development of this character as we do in later books in the series.
Right.
But I know that when I read this book for the first time, and this was prior to watching the show, when he pushes Bran out that window, I thought, I'm never forgiving this character ever.
Yeah.
Like, I was like, that's it. And even as I read on the series, I'm like, no, I'm not forgetting what he did in book 1. I'm not forgetting. But I don't know. I mean, I guess he was pretty desperate too in that moment with the secret that he had. And as far as Cersei, same thing. I don't feel like we got a little bit of Cersei, but she's way more of a side character in this particular book.
Yeah.
Are we going to grow to like Jaime in this? Is that what you're trying to say to me? I'm kind of nervous. I don't think I can forgive him after what he did. I don't know what to expect with him.
Is it spoilers to say that Jamie is one of my favorite characters in the series?
What?
Yeah.
So
Well,
the redemption
read
is
on.
real, I guess.
Well, it's
Man.
Martin. It doesn't have to be redemption. It's just
Yeah, right. You're right.
it never has
You
to
can,
be
you can just
redemption.
still
Pretty
like
much
him.
all
Yeah.
the characters are bad people. Well, that's not totally true, but he could just be less worse.
But
Then pushing a kid out of a window.
I
It's a
know.
low bar, but
I don't know
you
if I
have
should
to
be.
read on.
But
You have to read
he
on.
did do it for love, though, right?
The things we do for love. Yeah.
I
And
don't
he did
know.
live.
Yeah, I guess I'll just piggyback off what a lot of people said though. With Sansa, I feel conflicted with Sansa because I do think she's very young and she is seeing things. I mean, she has blinders on. She has blinders on as far as her idealism. I think things she said though, I mean, as far as her covering up for what's his name, for Joffrey in that particular scene that you were talking about, Jack, like what got to me actually was the scene right before it when she's having this perfect day with Joffrey and she's looking over at him and thinking about how gorgeous he is and they're in the woods writing together. Oh, I love writing. Even though she like just said to
she
her
hates
sister she hated writing. And then her sister ruins everything, but it's the way and her dialogue specifically at the end of that chapter, she said, stop when Joffrey and Arya are fighting. She says, stop, you're ruining it.
Yeah.
You're ruining it. And I was like, that is interesting. She doesn't say you're hurting each other.
Yeah.
Stop.
Yeah.
I don't want you to hurt each other. It's like you're ruining it. And I don't even think she's conscious of how the it is her fantasy. And I feel like Martin, I love what he does with her character
Yeah.
because he's showing that fantasy fairy tale idealism that some of us love growing up in fantasy, love about the genre, and he's shattering it through her character.
Yeah.
And I think it's also brilliant the way that he gets us to shift our perspective on her based on the heartbreak that she has to witness at the end. But it's also, man, her character is a tough one to read about because she is so attached to that ideal. She's so attached to that image, but also like she ends up betraying her family. She betrays her dad. She ends up going to Cersei and telling Cersei her dad's plan for them to escape. Just because she's that attached. She's that attached to her dream, to her fantasy. And then I really think it's brilliant how, even though we talk about how idealized she makes Joffrey to be, by the end, she looks at him and she sees his lips as those beautiful pouty lips she was in love with. They look like worms. That's how she describes them. And he suddenly looks disgusting to her. And I love the way it's like almost like a horror book at that point. It's like Martin takes a fantasy idealism through Sansa's character and turns it into grim, dark fantasy horror through her interactions with Joffrey. So I thought it was brilliant. And of course, everybody mentioned Sandor and the Hound, basically, and how the Hound interacts with her is just incredible. As far as Robert Baratheon, I think I love Robert because he's so funny and he does have a certain charisma to him, but he's also detestable at the same time through some of the way he lets himself go, the way he is so horrible as a leader in some ways, and lazy, and I don't know. And it's interesting what you said, Philip, because I do think that actor has made me like that character more too. Mm-hmm. And somebody was saying that last week about Catelyn Stark, that the actress who plays Catelyn in the show does such an incredible job that you can't help but like her in some sense. But just to piggyback off thoughts on Catelyn Stark, she's a bit of a tough one to read about because you get a sense, especially later in the book, as to why I feel like Martin fills in later in the book why she acts the way she acts. It was a little hard for me as a reader to get behind why she would leave her after she grieves so much over Bran and his fall and her son possibly never being able to walk again, let alone wake up from his coma, how suddenly she just goes through this crazy grief, nearly gets killed, and then wakes up and says, I'm leaving. I'm going to King's Landing. She doesn't she just leaves her 2 sons behind, and she doesn't even think to send somebody else, and she's gonna go and disguise herself on the King's Road. I mean, it just seemed very rash to me. All of it seemed very rash, and even just taking Tyrion as hostage, all of it just seemed kind of rash. But at the same time, you do get filled in later on in the book about how she does these things because the men in her life have always left her behind. She was always left waiting. She was waiting for Ned. She was waiting for her father. She was always the woman in waiting, and she felt like she wanted to take action, and this was her way to do it. So in some ways, I feel like Martin fills in for her reasons, but it was still kind of hard to get behind the rashness of her decisions sometimes.
Yeah. I think that what I take from this is that like every character pretty much has a reason that you could like them, not even necessarily in their like traits as a person, but because they're so interesting to read. And then there are reasons to dislike most of the characters too.
Most of them,
They're so fun to read about.
Yeah.
All of them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Fantastic.
And I
so
think that's,
go ahead.
I was going to say, I think that's similar to, I don't know as a first-time reader where a lot of these characters are, like where their loyalties lie. Like if we look at Tyrion, for example, like I don't know if he's like a good guy or a bad guy because he obviously loves his family. He talks about that over and over, but he also doesn't condone a lot of the things that they do. So I think the reasons, you know, that you can both like characters and dislike them, I kind of also go back and forth if they're good guys or bad guys or who they're loyal to. So they are very complex characters in both those ways.
That's such a good point. I do feel like the characters and their relationship, their family dynamics are really interesting. The family dynamics with the Starks it's very different than the family dynamics with the Lannisters. There's still some sense of family loyalty with the Lannisters. You see that maybe a little bit more heart, especially between Jaime and Tyrion. But the rest of their family loyalty in the Lannisters feels more like a prideful type of alliance than it is a heartful one. Whereas with the Starks, and with the Starks, there's complexity there too, though, especially with Jon Snow. But for the most part, it feels like there is a little bit more heart with most of the dynamics there too. That's a really good point about where loyalties lie.
I have a kind of addendum to least likable, but in a roundabout way, in the sense that I think theoretically Bran is a great character. When I think about Bran, I think, man, he's great in terms of what he's doing, the sense of taking this kid who wanted to be a knight and then having him, and each chapter feels so mundane because you're feeling how he feels, etc. Whenever I think about it on a theoretical level, I'm like, Bran is great. But then when I'm actually reading Bran, I'm like, I'm gonna skim. My eyes are gonna glaze a little. I won't lie to you. I'm gonna fill in the gaps.
Yeah,
I think that's I think that is simultaneously a strength in terms of he I think with the strength of everyone else's POVs, the fact that if you're reading a Tyrion chapter, if you reach a Tyrion chapter, you just want to go through it. I think on the strength of that, you're allowed the characters like Bran who have a slower start to kind of allow that longer like a longevity to their journey. But I do also think that he's not a dislikable character. I just sometimes felt like we could probably we can get through some of this maybe.
That's really insightful though, Ben, like where you're made to feel a little bit like depressed, and it's like you said, mundane, and it's a bit slow, and you feel like he's not doing what he wants to do and all this stuff. Like it's kind of a chore to read through, but I think there's purpose to that, like you alluded to as well. So that was good insight.
Oh, that's a really good point. Yeah.
Yeah.
Both of you had great points with that.
It's not fun to read his chapters, and it's not supposed to be.
Derry's point is amazing as well.
The Jaime is fascinating to me because he's a blank character. He's a facet of Cersei and a facet of his father. And it's only when he's separated from both that he begins to become a real person. Yeah,
that's interesting.
He has an interesting journey for sure in later books.
Well, Cersei kind of alludes to that in book 1 too, when I'm almost positive that it's during her conversation with Ned when she says that her and Jamie are like one person, like they complete each other, etc. Like,
Yeah,
I
she says that a little bit more disgustingly than that.
yeah, that's true. She does. But
Yeah.
like with that general sentiment, I feel like she has had a lot more of an opportunity to, like, even if she doesn't, I don't know, have her full independence when she's married to Robert, she has her own agenda and she has much more of a personality. Whereas I feel like for most of their lives, Jamie, I suppose, was a member of the Kingsguard before Robert was king, but for the most part, it feels like he follows her around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do we know, this is like little details, like do we know they're obviously twins? Do we know who's the older?
Yeah, Cersei is older.
Cersei is. Oh, okay, yeah, that jives. Yeah, interesting. That's the vibe that I got. Yeah. Okay.
We have a question
Gross.
here regarding.
Actually, oh, sorry. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say. I mean, part of her character is because she's the elder, but because she's a woman,
Right.
she isn't
Right.
given the rights of an elder child, and
Right.
there's kind of a point there that Cersei, as much as she's not the most lovable character, she has some genuine grievances.
Yeah.
I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you see that with her, especially being the one female in the family that's left. And it's interesting because, like I was saying earlier about Catelyn feeling like the men always leave her behind, and how she wants to take charge of that situation by, I guess, going to King's Landing, which I'm not sure was the most wise decision. But it's interesting the way that Martin does that. He does that with her character. He does that with Cersei's character. And he does that with Dany's character, too. I mean, Dany is made to feel very, she's exploited. She's exploited by her brother. And she's just a means to his crown. And being Khaleesi, her time as Khaleesi it has a number on it. As long as Khal Drogo is alive, she's Khaleesi. But once he dies, she is to go and be a crone over in the Vias Dothrak area there. And so it's just interesting how she decides to take charge of that at the end to make a new path for being a Khaleesi after Khal Drogo's death. So it's interesting because there's a lot of like, obviously it's like patriarchy world and patriarchy in the world, but it seems like Martin, all the female characters are aware that they have a place and they're all gonna fight that and respond to that in their own way. It's just really interesting.
Yeah, in the same vein as Dany, like inevitably having her authority attached to Drogo, it's interesting how like after Robert dies, Cersei has kind of positioned herself to have her son, a person who she can maybe influence more on the throne, like so that she kind of manages to attach her power more subtly to him. And then, but then with Joffrey being who he is, obviously things go sideways because he's like a prideful little shit. So
Joffrey's the worst. Oh,
I think they're meant to call that a little lion. I think it's lion they prefer to use.
Well,
yeah. Sorry.
Yeah.
It's interesting too how I think sometimes we see Catelyn and we're willing to give her a pass because she's being a mother, and she's protecting her kids. And for some reason, we're less willing to give Cersei a pass for the same thing, essentially. Is she's very protective of her children. But
yeah.
Yeah, I mean they mirror each other in a lot of interesting ways as far as that, and it's neat because even though they are enemies in a sense, they both have that strength of motherhood. They both are fierce mothers in their own right. So this question, did we answer this regarding?
I feel like I think we should not answer that question because I think that has further implications.
Okay.
To later, but so I don't think that's...
Ben is actually right.
Yeah, that's...
something in that comment doesn't happen.
Right.
Okay, we'll go ahead and move on then. And now I guess we're just on, if there's anything else anybody wants to share about unlikable characters that we didn't cover, or just go into favorite character moments. So what was your favorite character moment, Theo?
So as a first time reader of the books, all these, like, everything was so exciting to read for the first time. And like I said, all the shows, like, or the show itself wasn't really in my memory when I was reading this. And there were some things that I just completely forgot that would have happened. And so some of these small moments that other readers on a reread particularly may have breezed through, I was like excited about. So even little things like when they first find the dire wolves, I was like, I love animal companions. I'm like, this is gonna be awesome. And then when John kind of steps in to allow them to keep it and kind of fights for that, and then says, you know, I'm not a Stark, like, really, those are your kids and they should have whatever. And then when he gets Ghost, I was like, yes, this is going to be awesome. So I was just excited for all of that. And I think Daenerys wasn't a favorite character of mine, but I liked her arc in the book. And I think the marriage and like consummation with Khal Drogo and how that kind of sets up and then builds momentum for the rest of her arc and how she's invested and how she kind of takes control from there on was really, really cool. The moment where Bran finds out and gets pushed, I was like, holy crap. Like I still couldn't believe that happened. I was like, wow, this is going to create some shit. So there were all these little moments that I was just like, even the little things that, like I said, readers, read and kind of, they're more in for the build up from those moments. Those little moments for me, I was just like, oh my God, I can't believe this is happening, like all throughout the book. So I was so excited reading this. It was such a good experience.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I could say as a rereader, I felt emotional throughout everything, even knowing everything that was going to happen.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I felt
Wow.
so emotional. Yeah.
Do you think you on a reread you appreciate those moments more because you know the impact? Because me, like, I don't know how these moments are going to affect anything. I mean, really. But you maybe going back, you feel a little bit more impact from those moments because you kind of know the rest of it. Is that?
Yeah, I wouldn't say, it's interesting because I wouldn't say I loved this book more on a reread than I did the first time. It was just different. So the first time it was more of there was a sense of dread when I was reading both times, but the first time it was more of a sense of dread and anticipation and suspense and wondering what the heck is going to happen and shock. Whereas the second time I actually found myself emotional. So I know we're probably going to talk about the Syrio and Arya Stark interactions later on, but that particular part, I'll just go ahead and say I started feeling tears come up in my eyes. And knowing what was going to happen to Ned, that got me very emotional this time. So I felt way more emotional this time than I did, like emotional in a sad sense, I guess, than I did the first time. It was more anticipation and suspense. And this time it was more like, oh, I'm emotional reading this. But both times, I think I liked him equally the same both times. Oddly, it was just a different experience.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Jack?
Gosh, there's a lot. So I really liked Sam as a character. So for some favorite moments, I just picture him as this like cuddly teddy bear, like cinnamon roll, gentle character. And I know there's no space for gentleness in this world. So I enjoyed seeing him. I'm scared for him. I'm really scared for him.
Yeah.
But the moments where, he joins the Watch and Jon Snow sticks up for him, makes everyone else like a hands-off rule pretty much, right? And then not only protecting him, but finding out what he's good at and putting him in a position to excel. I loved all those moments. Like I said, I'm scared for my boy Sam. I don't know how that's going to go for him. But I like those moments. And then, Daenerys is my favorite character. So I think, of course, any moment that was knocking her brother down a peg, I was cheering out loud. This is probably one of the most interactive books that I've read where I'm like talking to the book. And these were some of those moments. So when did he slap her or something? And then the others saw that and then they got the whip and wrapped it around his neck or something. And then he was forced to walk.
Yeah, that was awesome.
Yes.
Yeah.
I loved that. Loved that.
When he wore the molten crown, I was just like, yes. Get out of here. No one likes
and
you.
he thinks that he is this hotshot, right? And everybody's laughing at him. And Daenerys can see it, and she's embarrassed for him. Like, why doesn't he realize she doesn't speak the language either, but she knows that they're laughing at him, and he just doesn't get that. So seeing his downfall, his gradual downfall, was amazing.
Yeah.
So those were some of my favorite character moments.
One moment in there where she sets out this new robe that she had made for him and in the tent, and then he comes in and kind of just craps all over it, and I was just like gutted. I'm like, you know what? No, you're done to me now.
Yeah, and that's, I think that was really good for me because, again, I have a Disney heart. I want the good guys to win, the bad guys to lose. And in this book, the bad guys don't all get what they deserve, right? So it was nice to win this one. It was nice to win this one.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah.
I'm gonna completely echo that scene of introducing Sam. I think is the single best encapsulated chapter in the entire book. Like as an actual chapter, I think that has the best just general. Just it's like a short story. It works perfectly that chapter. My other is what's the sorry, I saw that, fellow. Don't worry.
That was great.
My other one is Tyrion and Jon shaking hands at the wall. I absolutely love that. Rereading it, I was like, I forgot how much I love Jon and Tyrion together, and it's so early in that book that they're one of my favorite relationships through the entire thing. And then the other is my other one. I know people are going to choose a different Syrio and Arya moment, but mine is when he throws the sword to her and she drops it, and he says, "Tomorrow you will catch it." Like that is for me.
Yeah.
Like thinking back on their relationship, that's the quintessential moment for me. So yeah, that they are without a doubt my go-tos. But yeah, Tyrion and Jon, their handshake, their entire relationship, the scene where Tyrion's messing around with Alyssa, like all of that is just fantastic.
Yeah, that's so perfect. I love that moment too. Fantastic.
I didn't have it like on my list, but that was just because I tried to pare it down. I definitely echo you on Tyrion and Jon, though. They are so good together.
Yeah. Yeah.
One that I also didn't have on, but I just wanted to mention quickly. It's probably like basic in a way because I think it's quoted a lot, but I just remember my feelings on my very first read because this happens almost immediately at the beginning of the book. And it's Bran's perspective when he's going to watch Ned execute the deserter that we see in the prologue. And it's like can a man still be brave if he's afraid? And it's like, that's the only time a man can be brave. Or I'm probably not quoting it exactly right, but that's always been one of my favorite lines. And I think that the reason for that is when I read it, I was like, oh, he's like clever. Like there's going to be some amazing dialogue and wisdom in this book. So it got me excited to read more of like what Martin had to say through characters' voices. But a few that I had were like Arya training with Syrio. And I'll let Philip and Joanna take that one because I have others. But one for me is near the end of the book when Joffrey forces Sansa to go up on the battlements with him. And he says something about bringing her brother's head. And she's like, maybe my brother will give me your head instead. And then I was like, okay. I hope you're right. And then I guess this is the same as what Ben just said, but I had Jon immediately defending Sam in the training yard when he arrives at the wall. And I do think that that's Sam's introduction. So I guess that's the same thing you were talking about. But I just love that not only does Jon like immediately jump to his defense, but because Jon has now managed to make friends, like all of them are immediately on board with like protecting Sam. We all know what kind of a man Alistair Thorne was, and it was just such a satisfying moment to watch them all stand up for him and protect him against like him and the other faction of the like boys at the wall who were against them. And then the final one that I have is Sansa and the Hound's conversation when he walks her home from the tourney. And that's when we learn a little bit about the Hound's backstory. And like, I love him as a character, and I love that he's kind of the first to try and pull the veil away from Sansa's eyes, because he's like, my existence, like the fact that my face looks the way it does, like purely just by me being present, I'm kind of ruining your little fantasy. Like, you need to look at me, and like, but at the same time, he's not cruel about it. He's rough in the way that he is as a person, but he's also like, you're a little bird taught to repeat her pretty words, and like, you need to realize that this isn't what life is. And like, my brother is a knight, but this is what he did to me when he was younger, and like, this is what the world is. So yeah, I apparently have a lot more to say about Sansa on this read than I ever realized before. But based on like what else has been said in the chat and what you guys have said, I just want to clarify that I don't think she's a good person. I just think that she's so interesting.
No, she is. Yeah.
So that was like, I had my little bullet pointed list to read out, and that was the ones that stood out to me.
Yeah. Beautifully said.
Now, these are all fantastic moments. I'm going to bring up one that I think no one has brought up yet, and it's kind of a mirror moment to what a couple of you mentioned in regard to Jon building some camaraderie among the younger members of the Wall. So the flip thing happens when he runs away to help his family, and he has betrayed his oath and all of that, and Pip and Gren and the others come after him. And I think that's just a great moment in there, where his investment in them has paid off with their investment in him. And I think Sam had something to do with orchestrating all that as well. So it's just all of them coming together to achieve that goal, I think was just a beautiful moment, actually. And then, of course, the one that I alluded to earlier when I was talking about my favorite character, the Serial Forel moment when he saves Arya from the Kingsguard and the other Lannister lackeys that have come after Arya. It's just something about her vulnerability there, and also his vulnerability as an old man, and yet he's facing these armored knights with a wooden sword as well, you know, and just the pure artistry of his ability to fend them off, knowing that this is probably it for him, you know, unless you buy into certain fan theories and that sort of thing, but knowing that this is probably it for him. And yet he just goes forward and does this really amazing thing. And it's a moment for him. If he indeed dies then, and we don't know because it's not described on the page, because Arya is the perspective character and she leaves, right? So she assumes that he's been killed, right? But it's a way for him maybe to go out as a legend, you know, as this is his final deed. And it's a way for him to show he hasn't quite lost it yet, right? I mean, he's so it's just a great moment, and it always gets me kind of emotional too, because of the fact that he's protecting a vulnerable person here. So yeah.
And you kind of believe he can do it too.
Yeah, it was one of those moments where that I was reading again for the first time. I'm reading and I'm like, oh no, like please, yeah. So funny. Yeah, you do kind of believe that maybe this will work out. He'll just kill everybody and follow Arya, but.
I'm going to believe that.
Yeah, I'd like to believe that too.
I'm choosing to believe that theory.
You know, I think there are theories that he might still be alive, but
I'm
I don't know.
glad Philip touched on that too, because I wasn't sure when I was reading. I'm like, am I supposed to know what happened? But it's good that we don't really know, and it was kind of left to us to interpret. But kind of the way you want it to have gone down. So because there's something special about him actually laying himself down, right? But. So
it was a powerful scene. It was a powerful scene. I mean, we all love the mentor trope, and that was kind of its own version of the mentor trope in a way, especially because Arya, you know, like we said, she marches to the beat of her own drum. She was her own person. She was never going to be the lady that her sister was going to be. And so for her father to embrace her, I think it was really special that he let her keep Sting. And what's the name of her sword?
Needle.
Oops, wrong sword.
Wrong series.
Wrong series. but the fact that Ned, actually, like I said, I think some of the parenting moments between Ned and Arya and Sansa, they just touched me in a very deep way, especially just thinking, I guess it gets to me a little emotionally, like just thinking, because our parents aren't going to be around forever. And especially in this case, we know he's not. And just seeing those moments, they're so meaningful. They're going to be so meaningful for Sansa and Arya forever. But the way that he speaks with them, he never talks down to them, and he's honest to them. It's just such brilliant parenting on the page. He's honest with them, and yet he speaks gently to them. And I thought it was beautiful the way that he seemed to understand them. He was willing to have empathy with them. And so empathy for them. So I appreciated those scenes especially. And I appreciated that scene where he's defending her at the end. Surreal. How do you say it? I'm sorry.
Syrio.
Today.
Syrio.
Thank you, Syrio. I just love the way he was defending her at the end. It really got to me. I would say there's so many scenes. This whole entire book has so many scenes, but I think that some of the scenes with Jon at the wall, the way we talked about how certain characters will internalize the way things other characters will say. But there was a scene when he is running away before his brotherhood comes to take him back, where he's going through in his mind all of the things that all the conversations he had with previous people. And that's sort of playing through his mind. It's a beautiful coming of age arc in a way for Jon in this story. And as far as Tyrion, I guess some of the scenes I wanted to talk about earlier were just how this character somehow managed to endear himself to me with his whole story about his interactions with his first whore, who he didn't know was a whore, and just the shame and sorrow and heartbreak that he experienced through his first love because of his father. So that strange relationship with his father, it was amazing, because I think that as a reader, I felt like Tyrion sharing that story and opening up about that, it breaks your heart. And at the same time as it breaks your heart as a reader to hear his story, you could tell it's also getting to Bronn, even though Bronn is very clear that he's in it for the coin. You could tell that Bronn is even moved by this story. But also the way that Tyrion, after that, he interacts with Tywin, and "Father, I'm so glad you're happy to see me." That's not his exact line, but just the way that he is so smug around his father, or the way his humor is just brilliant in this entire book. But yeah, so those were, there's so much we could talk about. And of course, I know we talked about Sansa quite a bit, but I think we talked about it last week for sure. The moment when she could have pushed Joffrey, like she could have.
She did.
I think that's it's those moments after she watches her poor father die, that suddenly you go from looking at Sansa, and Sansa having such a lack of empathy up until that point. It's easy to judge her and to feel a lack of empathy for her because she has a lack of empathy. But then I think the moment it becomes real for her with her father, and you see the evil she's pitted with Joffrey, and Cersei. Man, Cersei saying, "Oh, it's in the blood, you're the traitor blood, you have the traitor blood." Just seeing her whole struggle with that, her whole trauma with that, I think it makes you I feel like as a reader, you just can't help but feel for her after that, from that point on, and want to root for her. Any thoughts on that?
Well, this is kind of this is related to your general point, but it's a specific moment where I don't think it hit at home for me as much on a first read, but this time I think I was struck by how much if Joffrey wasn't a piece on the board, what Sansa did probably would have worked, because Cersei, while conniving and very much playing the Game of Thrones, has a lot more of a long game and isn't as impulsive, and wasn't because I don't think I realized the significance of the fact on my first read that they weren't actually supposed to execute Ned. that didn't strike me. I just thought like, oh, well, they were all in on it. But like really it was a much more well thought out plan, because he would have been a very valuable hostage. And it's like in hindsight obvious that Cersei would have, because like Sansa is obviously desperate to prove like, no, I don't have the traitor's blood. Like if I can just prove to you, like if my dad admits it, then like we're not traitors and like it'll work. And like obviously that's part of her whole thing about wishful thinking. But it's ironic that the young man that she wanted so badly to love is the one that ended up just ruining everything and setting the rest of the series into motion.
Yeah, that's such a good point.
It's a very
because
good point.
in a way, it's like he's not playing the game right.
Yeah.
He made a stupid move with that.
He's playing his own game.
Yeah.
Well, and I had a question for you guys too, because I think the first character moment that we meet Ned is the execution, right? That it's from Bran's point of view. So the first scene and the last scene with Ned are executions, but from very obvious. I don't know if there's any symbolism there, any meaning, but I did think that it was very interesting how his character journey was bookended by those two moments.
And with the same sword as well.
Yeah, I thought it was a little bit of like foreshadowing and stuff, because I kind of knew that was going to happen. I just didn't remember exactly how or why or what. But I think that there's a line or something when that's happening about like somebody's head or something about the kingdom or something like that. I have to go back. I think I highlighted it, but I was like, oh, like hang on a second, this is going to be interesting later with Ned. So yeah.
I also think it has a lot to do with like willful ignorance, because like we know like the first instance with Ned is that he is murdering someone that did actually see what he is claiming to have seen, and we are ignoring that. Like Ned is kind of willfully being like, well, he's lying, and it's kind of the same. It's the same with Ned at the end. Is him having this truth that no one willfully wants to believe that is there. And kind of being that one person that knows the truth, but everyone else is willing to ignore it. I think there's a lot of holdovers for those two scenes.
I think another holdover or symbolism is the fact that Ned is about the person that passes the sentence should. Oh, it's literally what Kyle said. Ned is all about the person that passes the sentence should be the person that swings the sword, whereas Joffrey obviously does not subscribe to that. And doesn't have to do it.
Yeah, I mean, that was all part of who Ned was as a person. I don't think he took any, and he didn't, like Joffrey, he didn't take any joy out of doing that.
Yeah.
I cannot remember his name, who starts with a G, who he ends up killing that first scene.
Garrett?
But he was from the prologue.
Oh,
Who?
yeah.
Jared? I don't know if it's Jared or Garrett, but
Jared or Jared, yeah. Anyway.
I think another scene that is like around Ned's death is I really like Varys talking to Ned in the cell, and particularly I think it's the line where he's like, why is it when all you lords play your Game of Thrones, it's the innocent that like suffer, or something, or like civilians that suffer. And I think it is innocent, and then you've kind of got the idea of like Ned then being the one that dies and being a shock to the audience, in terms of that we know in this that he is the one that knows the truth, and that he is innocent compared to the malice of everyone else, and that eventually he's going to be the one that dies, is also a nice bit of foreshadowing throughout that scene. And I think that's also it's a great character bit for Varys to be from that point of view of saying, yeah, exactly, like it's a great scene for him being like, the idea of I'm doing this for the realm, and you truly believe in that he, like, the same reason when he says that he's there, like there's a reason that he kept Robert and wanted Robert there, is that he was a bad king, but he kind of he just maintained the realm, and for him that's all that matters. And well, actually I was going to say more, but that goes past book one, so I'll stop myself right there.
You know, a big moment we didn't mention, I think, is the final chapter with Daenerys and
Yeah.
the emergence of the dragons. I mean, whoa, that's
Yeah,
a
that was pretty
pretty
cool.
awesome finish to the book, and one of my favorite Daenerys moments too.
Yeah.
So,
It was
yeah.
very, very powerful. That has to be my favorite moment of the whole book.
Yeah,
love
I
that
did
for her.
not see that one coming on the first, well, obviously not on the first read, but it was something that I just very much did not see coming because it's so separate from all the politics in Westeros. It's happening in a different place. And then you're like, oh, okay, so this is where this book was culminating to.
I mean, talk about seizing your destiny. I mean, she's gone from basically being handed around like a chess piece to finally saying, no, I'm in charge of myself now. Boom, here. So I thought that was brilliant. Great moment.
Yeah.
I was happy to finally understand like all the different memes and everything I see and the term Mother of Dragons.
Oh,
I was shocked to see how literal that was. But I was like, oh, okay, that's happening. But I'm here for it.
I also now that we've cracked onto that, I feel like a character that I simultaneously is one of my favorites and one of my least likable is I don't know their full name, but Miri, the
Mary
witch. Like,
Master.
yeah,
yeah.
she
Oh,
is
yeah.
so fascinating, and on a reread as well, you really see from her perspective why she does what she does, and that she is absolutely justified in taking whatever revenge she can. Like the idea that we're meant to have any sympathy for Drogo, who like is they beat her. They beat her. Like it's the idea they're beating her. They've already abused her in other ways. Like it is horrific. And then because we're following the naive Daenerys, that you feel like, oh no, Daenerys is trying her best, but it's horrible and absolutely justified for me. She can, she deserved her revenge without a doubt.
While we're in a slight pause, I'm just going to excuse myself because I had about an hour and a half to spend with you all, but I have to go into work tonight, so I have to go to sleep.
Oh.
Yes, but I really, really enjoyed this. And Joanna, thank you so much for having me. And yeah, it was a lot of fun. So.
You're absolutely welcome. Thank you so much.
Hi,
Great
Grace.
for joining us. Hey.
Sweet dreams.
Thank you.
I loved your thoughts. I loved hearing your thoughts. So thank you so much.
You too. Okay.
Yeah.
Bye.
I was trying to remember, and Kyle accuses me of yeah, I am really bad at remembering names and pronouncing them, and I am aware of that. But that particular character that you were just talking about, Ben, and I cannot remember how to say her name.
I think Miri, that's how I pronounce it.
Miri.
Yeah.
Miri Mazdur.
That has to be, that is honestly like one of my favorite. I don't know if it's a trope or not, but I feel like I've seen it in a few different books now. But it's one of my favorite sort of plot devices is when you have a character who's an older, supposedly magical priest or priestess who knows so much, and you basically bargain your soul with that character and the cost that you have to pay for that. It's hard to talk about that in any other book without giving away a spoiler, but I love how that played out because I just felt like, oh yeah, we cannot trust this person.
No.
It's pretty obvious, but man, it still burns when it happens. It's still, no pun intended, but it was still very impactful.
Yeah, always read the fine print before you make any kind of agreement. Because
Yeah.
I was thinking that when she said it requires a sacrifice, I think the natural question is like, of what type?
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
you kind of want to get commitment on that one and not make assumptions, but
I think the thing I like in that as well is that there's the idea that she's aware, like in that moment, she knows what the sacrifice is, and that she's also willfully ignorant to kind of just being impulsive in that moment because of the grief she's going through. That I think that's the thing that Martin does really well in terms of characters. I think is just the concept of people making terrible decisions or being bad people, but really justifying the emotion behind it.
Yeah.
That you can't help but hate it, but also go, yeah, I understand. But
yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. Anything else anybody wants to bring up about character work or even moments or anything about Game of Thrones?
I'll just say that I'm finally aware of just the reason, or maybe the merit the series has for rereads. Like I never really understood how someone can derive so much value on read after read after read, or to what extent this material can be taught in a course or dissected in different ways. Like there's so much happening here, and everybody continues to touch on that. But it's really incredible, and now I can really understand why people love this. I mean, I've only read the first book. I'm about a third of the way through the second, but I'm already starting to see how interesting it would be to go back and read even just the first book again as you get further and further along. And so I get why people reread this whole thing, and how it can be, as incomplete as it is, a favorite among so many readers. It's incredible. So now I get it, and I understand the hype.
Yeah. I mean, that's the argument I always have when people say, oh, I don't want to start a series that's not finished.
That was a reservation I had. I'm like, well, what?
But
am
I'm
I
like,
going to get a, yeah, what am I going to
there's
get? But
a
there's so much
reason why
there.
people are upset that it's not finished, because it's so
Yeah.
good, because it's
Yeah.
so worth reading the first time.
Yeah.
And I know that that's a challenge, and I understand it. I get it. I get the frustration about the fact it's not finished, but I still think it's so worth reading anyway.
Yeah.
Who knows if we'll get the next books. I hope so. But anyway, yeah. And I think one more thing I'll just say to you, Theo, and to you, Jack. Yeah, as a rereader, I think the other thing that's beautiful about the reread experience, though, is, especially after you read on in the series, is the amount of foreshadowing that you see in book one. There is a ton of foreshadowing that you don't realize is right there on the page.
So I'm not a note taker. I'm not an annotator. I have such admiration for people that can mark things up and make everything so pretty, like Jack can do, and people that journal stuff. I can't do that, and I just don't take the time to. This book, or this series so far, has made me reconsider that. I'm like, I think this is one where I should really take my time and mark stuff down and be able to go back and look at some stuff and really diarize as I go. It's part of the reason why I started a channel, to be able to kind of, remember my own thoughts and diarize as I go, and maybe theorize and look back and see how stupid I was, things like that. So I think this book makes me want to start to take some notes.
Yeah,
I think it'd be worthwhile.
I don't even know that you have to do that. I know that the first time I read this series, I didn't take a single. I
Not for
trying
an
to.
understanding, but more for like, just to kind of go back and like put things together and stuff, right? That more for fun than to remember. Because you're right, it's a lot more digestible than I thought it would be. So it's really not like that. Whereas for like a series like Malazan, which I'm sure we'll talk about another time when I start it at some point, I feel like that would be for the purpose of making sure I'm understanding and recalling what I should to derive the most value from it. Here, it's just like, it'd be interesting to see my thoughts as I progress. That's all. So
yeah. It's interesting. I think you'll get a lot, though, just as a first time reader of both series, but of this one, I think that you don't. I don't think you have to be. It's an interesting series. I think this was a conversation that I had with Jimmy, is that this is a series. He brought up such a good point, that this is such a great bridge series for a lot of people, and that you can read this kind of in a superficial, just fun way, and be thoroughly entertained. But you can also dive really
as deep as you want. And now I get that, because I was like, I don't know if I could just like enjoy it as a whatever, but you absolutely can. Yeah.
You can go off the deep end for sure in the series. Absolutely. So wonderful. Well, I guess that's about it for now. And I want to thank everybody who showed up in the comments section, Kyle and Derry, and I see Mark here, and so many others that have shown up and left such wonderful, insightful comments. I appreciate you all so much. And thank you to my lovely guests. So thank you so much for giving me your Saturday afternoon, Theo and Jack and Ben, and of course, Grace, who was here, and Philip Chase. So thank you all so much.
Pleasure. Thank you for being a wonderful host, Joanna, and for inviting us. This has been a lot of fun. I love revisiting the story. I haven't talked about it much. I only have a couple of little videos on my channel on A Song of Ice and Fire. So this was fun. Thank you.
You're welcome. I was so excited to invite you, Philip, because I knew that you had taught the book before in your course, but had also read it 5 times. And I just thought that it would be interesting to hear your thoughts. And I really appreciated them. And I just appreciated everybody, everything. I think it was wonderful to hear the first time reader reactions to things. And it was fun to hear rereader reactions to things. So this was fantastic. Thank you all again so much and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys.
Hey.